Hello everyone, my name is Christina Farita, and on behalf of ICDX Group, the leading commodity exchange in Indonesia, I would like to welcome all of you in today's webinar. In a collaboration with B20 Indonesia, initiated by the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, we brought to you the first webinar of Carbon series with the theme of Organized Voluntary Carbon Marketplace to tackle the global climate crisis. A little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel, and we will bring them up during the questions and answer sessions later. Now, without further ado, I will turn the time over to our moderator, Ms. Kuki Suyahmun, co-founder and executive director at Indonesia Research Institute for Decarbonization. To Ms. Kuki, the platform is yours.
Thank you so much, Mbak Christina. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kuki Suyahmun, and as already introduced earlier by Mbak Christina, so I'm here basically to help to moderate the session. So hopefully we can have a very interesting session. As we know that carbon market will, like it or not, will play a significant role in our effort to achieve the Paris Agreement goal, and this is already an agreement that already adopted by countries including Indonesia, and each already has their own commitment and target also. So today discussion is basically to learn from the experiences from our knowledgeable resource person on how basically we can manage a voluntary carbon market or offset market to help us in addressing the issue of climate crisis. So I think without further ado, let us now start our session today, and we will have an opening remarks that have been taped earlier by Mr. Arif Rahmat, who is the chair of B20 Trade and Investment Task Force. So let us hear his remark.
Greetings, distinguished speakers and all participants of this webinar. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the ICDX Group for collaborating with B20 so that this webinar event is held as a series towards the B20 Summit. And also sincere gratitude to the distinguished speakers who are willing to attend and provide their valuable insights at this event. It is widely accepted that climate change gives rise to many existential threats, such as the quality and quantity of water, habitats, forests, health, agricultural land, and coastal ecosystems. Overcoming this challenge demands collaborative and concerted actions on a global scale. It also requires solidarity among countries of different development stages. Carbon emission, especially carbon dioxide or CO2, has been identified to have 80% contributions to greenhouse gas emission. Therefore, the functioning of an effective carbon market with its carbon pricing mechanism should significantly reduce CO2 emission levels in the atmosphere. It is hoped that over time, the exchange between the amount of carbon emitted and captured, which is spurred by the financial incentive from the market, would balance out globally. To attract the interests of as many countries as possible, the carbon market must operate on the principles of transparency, integrity, inclusivity, and fairness for all. This issue fits with our policy recommendation draft under the B20 Trade and Investment Task Force. In particular, our fourth recommendation stresses the need for trade and investment to be the key vehicle for sustainable development in alignment with the SDGs. Within this recommendation framework, we fully support the establishment of a well-functioning carbon market that is consistent with the WTO rules and the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We also aspire to have a market mechanism that allows both the private and public sectors to contribute to lowering the overall carbon emission. Following ratification of the Paris Agreement, the carbon trading scheme should also be aligned with the interests and goals of a country's NDC, or nationally determined contribution. For its parts, the Indonesian government has issued Presidential Regulation number 98, 2021, concerning the administration of carbon pricing, which is expected to be followed by a set of ministerial regulations. Such regulations would lay out the foundation for rules and technicalities of carbon trading in Indonesia, including the possibility of a cap and trade system and the implementation of a carbon tax. In the end, with all available options being considered, the world needs an effective global carbon trading system that is safe and fair, especially for the less developed and developing countries. Hence, the significance of today's discussion at addressing several long-standing yet fundamental questions for carbon trading. This includes questions such as, how does the carbon offset market look like? What is the mechanism by which the carbon offset is measured, and how does that work in the market in a more transparent way? How does the carbon offset market fulfill a government's mission and NDC? What are the means to stimulate a carbon offset market and to be well received globally? How do the NDC and carbon offset market complement each other? What are the opportunities in a carbon offset market? It is my hope that we will have better understanding to the answer to these questions after listening to today's presentations and discussion. So without further ado, I would like to invite all participants to pay attention to the presentation from our distinguished speakers, Ms. Alice Carr, Executive Director, Public Policy, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, Ms. Paula DiPerna, Special Advisor for CDP, Member Distinguished Advisory Board of Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, and a market practitioner, Mr. Lemon Ratan, the CEO of ICDX. And last but not least, Ibu Kuki, co-founder and executive director at Indonesia Research Institute for Decarbonization, as the moderator for the panel discussion. Thank you. And once again, let's have a great session and a great learning today.
Great. So we have heard the opening remarks from our chair, the B20 task force chair. So now I think it's right timely that we can start our session. As already mentioned earlier by Pak Arif, we have three very knowledgeable, distinguished resource person for our session today. And of course, and I also just checked the participants. We have more than 260 participants joining us online. So this is a very good number. And I think this is because the issue is very interesting and everyone would like to know the role of carbon market and how basically we can, if I can say, take the most benefit out of the carbon market itself. So I think I will just now start. Oh, before that, I would like to introduce, even though already introduced earlier, our resource person for today's session. So the first one, we have Miss Alice Carr, who is, I hope I get pronounce your name rightly, Alice. Alice is currently the Executive Director of Public Policy, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ. And Alice already has a long experience also in this issue. Our second resource person would be Ms. Paula DiPerna, who is currently the Special Advisor of CDP and also member for the Distinguished Advisory Board of Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. And last but not least, and also the very knowledgeable person with all the experience in all these trading issues is Mr. Lemon Rutan, who is currently the CEO of ICDX. So we have quite some times, but as always, if we start this kind of session and start with the discussion also, then time usually fly very fast. So I think I will just now start with our first resource person, which is Miss Alice Carr. And I just want to share with you like a short bio. I'm sure this is a very short bio of hers. So Miss Alice Carr is now the Executive Director for Public Policy at the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ, which is this organization is working at pace to ensure that the global financial system can deliver on its net zero commitments. Prior to joining GFANZ, Alice had a 2-decade career in central banking, most recently leading the Bank of England's International Strategy and Policy Division, including supporting Governor Andrew Bailey on the bank's contribution to the successful UK G7 presidency finance track, and also G20 Financial Stability Board engagement post-COVID, and also work on market access and trade agreements. Alice supported Governor Mark Carney on his international work for 3 years, including during his time as the Financial Stability Board chair. Prior to this, he worked for several years at the Hong Kong Monetary Authority on a cross-sectoral resolution framework and in a niche consultancy supporting finance ministries, central banks, and regulators in 20 countries to strengthen financial stability and a framework as the global financial crisis began. She started her career at the South Korean Embassy in London. Now she has a master's degree in economics and finance from Universidad de Navarra and in history from University of Cambridge. So welcome, Alice, to this session. And I would like to say, thank you so much for spending your time here, sharing your time with us, your valuable time, of course. And I know that it's still early out there. If I'm not mistaken, you are based in the UK, right? So it's still early there. But nevertheless, I'm sure that you would be more than happy to share with all of us some of the experiences that you already had. I have a couple of questions for you. But I think, this will be the question just to trigger your views. So feel free also to add some more, additional information as well. But the first question, Alice, from your point of view, how carbon offset market or basically voluntary carbon and carbon offset market can make a real difference in addressing climate change? So please, Alice.
Thank you. And I have some prepared remarks, so I'll which
sure.
hopefully address.
Yeah,
that.
please.
So
Sorry, please.
Hopefully they won't be too long. So I just wanted to say thank you very much to the Indonesian G20 presidency for inviting me to be with you today for this important session. I was going to try and set the scene and then maybe suggest some steps that we could all collectively take to try and deliver on the shared goal of ensuring that carbon markets can play their part in delivering on our net zero commitments. I was just going to note before I do that just a few days ago, the G7 finance ministers and central bank governors in their communique noted that we recognise the potential of high integrity carbon markets and carbon pricing to foster cost-efficient reductions in emissions levels, drive innovation, and enable a transformation to net zero through the optimal use of a range of policy levers to price carbon. So it's obviously still high up their agenda. But I also note that in his remarks at Davos, the Indonesian Minister of Investment emphasized the critical importance of global coordination and collaboration to ensure a level playing field and ensure that finance flows in the right direction. So I was just going to try and consider those issues a bit further. I think the high level context, which the previous speaker flagged, was that we know from the science that the carbon budget will be exhausted by the end of the decade on current trajectories. And so there's an urgency to what we do to reduce carbon emissions that requires that we deploy all levers we have available. Now is not the time for perfect solutions. And it's clear that effective public and private carbon markets have an important role to play as one of a set of policy tools to create the incentives for transition to net zero. obviously by placing a cap on emissions, by taxing, by establishing trading schemes with appropriate pricing, companies can be incentivized to reduce their emissions, offset them or remove them. And additionally, and I think this is probably one of the key things we might want to talk about today, if we can achieve effective cross-border markets, that will help ensure both an efficient transition globally, but also a just transition, and will deliver better outcomes for all of us. And I just wanted to say that on that front, that the tightness of the carbon budget creates a need to ensure that major companies are really doing everything they can to reduce their emissions. So we can't allow carbon markets to be an excuse to, as they sometimes are at the moment, to just allow customers to feel better about their flights or their purchases or whatever. We need to really bear down on carbon emissions. But even doing that is probably not enough in itself. You know, we're very, very close to not being able to hit 1.5 degrees. And so we need to bear down on emissions with all energy, but we also need to pursue offsets and removals with equal energy in parallel, not sequentially, but in parallel. And so, it seems to me, and it seems to us, that if we could establish high quality cross-border markets, we could achieve a scenario where, advanced economy corporates can purchase high quality offset removal credits that support nature-based solutions now and carbon capture technology in the future. And that sort of approach could be really instrumental in helping countries like Indonesia to preserve nature, but also to reduce emissions through time. And some of the academic studies into these kinds of cooperative solutions where we establish effective markets that are linked show that they seem to deliver the most efficient outcomes for all of us, i.e. the best, the most economically effective and efficient outcome to hitting our climate objectives. And so to make that a success, I just wanted to consider some of the things we might need. And just to note, I'm here from Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which some of you may know of, some of you may not. But we are basically a coalition of 450 major financial institutions from 45 countries who have committed to hitting net zero by 2050, and by making substantial reductions by 2030. And we intend to do that in several ways. One is that all of our members need to undertake transition planning to explore how they're going to transition to net zero. So we're helping them to do that. We are also working as hard as we can to support the kinds of initiatives that we're seeing emerging from G7 and G20 to finance transition in emerging markets. And thirdly, we are asking global policymakers and national policymakers to do what they need to do to support this transition, because of course the financial system could not do it on its own. And in that context, we made a series of requests of policymakers and others and the private sector at COP that pertain to carbon pricing and carbon markets. So as well as asking for governments and policymakers to take action to implement carbon pricing, carbon markets, etc., and to reinvest the proceeds to offset both the impact on vulnerable people, but also to support investment in the green solutions we need. We also pressed for greater standardization and scale for voluntary carbon markets globally, utilizing Article 6, and trying to address some of the issues that have been of greatest concern, such as double counting and so on. And we also asked them to commit to supporting an international body to provide guidance on the appropriate use of offsets, quality standards, offset types, and so on to deliver integrity. I just saw one of the comments that I didn't prepare slides. I'm really sorry. So we're 6 months on from COP, so I just thought I'd take a look at how we're actually doing against what we described as our call to action. And it's clear that the net zero commitments that governments have made have resulted in a tick up in public initiatives around carbon pricing and carbon markets. And quite a few have been added in the last few years, and quite a few are still under consideration. The World Bank has good stats on this. But nonetheless, we're still only covering kind of just over 20% of global emissions with these sorts of formal markets. And the pricing is wildly variable from close to nothing through to over $100 a ton. So there's clearly a lot more to do there. It's clear that a lot of the benefit would come from being able to link schemes, and Article 6 is helpful in that sense because it tells us that it's okay, as long as it's done properly, to trade our efforts, our carbon reduction efforts, and thereby through a cooperative approach, achieve a degree of efficiency, which is welcome. And some of the infrastructure needed to help put that in place was established, such as a central supervisory body. But there's more to do to operationalize Article 6. And I think that's something that we're keen to support and encourage, so that we can really, benefit from that common architecture. And the thing I was just going to note there is that whilst that is being done, there is scope within Article 6, under Article 6.2, to develop kind of best-in-class examples of cooperative approaches. And there are some examples of those kind of emerging. So I think Switzerland and Peru are doing something, GGGI are doing something with Sweden and some other countries and some emerging markets. And so those kind of link-ups between the sorts of countries that are, advanced economies that are bearing down on emissions, and the sorts of countries like Indonesia who have nature-based solutions, who could form a useful partnership, is something that I think should be welcomed while we put the kind of top-down architecture in place. And then the third thing I just wanted to notice is that the efforts of the private sector are clearly, self-organizing private sector are clearly incredibly important. And on the supply side, we've got the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, ICBCM, which is a private sector-led initiative that's set and enforce governance standards and ensure the integrity of high-quality carbon credits. They have very broad membership, represents the carbon market value chain, and a robust advisory panel. And they are working to set out some core carbon principles that they will put out for consultation in July. And they will help to establish the threshold standards for quality across the different types of carbon credits, which is incredibly important for scaling these markets, as has already been mentioned. And so on our part, we will be engaging with that process and the consultation, and it's something we really need to support. It's also the case that on the demand side, that the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative is working to try and ensure that voluntary carbon markets make a significant, measurable, and positive contribution to net zero transition. And they're trying to fill gaps in governance infrastructure with clear, practical, and robust claims guidance, and consideration for eventual regulation and country input. So, we've got a big private sector initiative on the supply side, a big private sector initiative on the demand side. And I think we sort of collectively need those to succeed. If we can move from having lots of small initiatives domestically to something more meaningful. And the fourth thing I was just going to flag in terms of how we're doing, and maybe this is just because I used to be a central banker, I spent too long on the public policy side of things, but there's definitely been a growing interest, I think, in the last year or so from financial sector regulators and standard setters in these markets. And personally, I think that's quite welcome, because, and so examples of this are that in the US, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission are now kind of gathering input from their market to try and understand these markets, and I guess understand how they link to formal markets that already exist, sort of more long-standing financial markets. And another example is that the kind of governing body for securities regulators everywhere. The International Organization for Securities Commissioners, or IOSCO, is now reviewing carbon markets to see how they can play a role. And I think, you know, having a greater interest from government and regulators in how to take the very good initiatives that the private sector and many partners, many interested stakeholders, including those who can support the nature-based solutions, is incredibly important. And there's kind of quite a tried and tested road where, you know, the private sector self-organizes and delivers something good, and then governments give it a boost by implementing it more formally. So where do we go from here? I'll just make 4 quick suggestions, and then I'll stop talking so we can have a discussion and move on. So I guess my suggestions for reaction, and these are for reaction, you know, we're not in GFANS delivering carbon pricing and carbon markets is something we want to support, but it's not something we work on day to day. So I think we should this year strive to coalesce around a shared view across key stakeholders of what carbon markets can do for us in terms of delivering on net zero, given where we are in the journey, informed by the high ambition that we need in the science and what the science tells us. So we do need to bear down on emissions as an absolute priority, but in parallel rather than sequentially, we need to use carbon markets really wisely to offset difficult to abate emissions and support removal, ensure that, you know, we're making the most of the nature-based solutions we have and that we can expand, and then technological solutions which may follow. I think given that we're a quarter of a way through what must be the decade of delivery, if we're going to hit our 1.5 objectives, we really need to have a push to get the overarching architecture in place, make sure that the infrastructure around Article 6 gets up and running and helps link private markets to the delivery of national net zero commitments, because that would, you know, that's what would make the big difference. I think we need to urgently complete the work that the private sector is doing on the supply and demand side, and so we should support those initiatives and help them get over the line. And I think, as mentioned, that we should, you know, we've had a very broad set of stakeholders involved in this work. I would suggest expanding it just a bit further and trying to draw in the regulators and standard setting bodies for the financial sector, so that we can really make progress on linking local markets and creating global markets. So in short, you know, we know that we're facing an unprecedented and urgent crisis. We need to do everything we can. Carbon markets and high integrity offsets removals are essential tool. So we've got to draw on them. And I think I would just emphasize again, and this may be something that's not front and center of G7 finance ministers and central bank governors' minds when they talk about carbon pricing and carbon markets, but the cooperative approach that links advanced economies and emerging markets is the one that would deliver the most efficient outcomes globally, and so it's really worth pushing for. I think it's worth remembering that, you know, if you're in a G7 economy, for many of them, even introducing a national scheme is a huge challenge, and so you get very focused on how to do that. But the real prize is, you know, being able to link markets in London with markets in Jakarta. So yeah, I think we should keep pushing for that kind of outcome, given we need to do everything we can. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alice, for a very comprehensive remarks that you did earlier. And I think there are quite a number of issues, and I saw already there are quite a number of questions in our Q&A box, but we will go there a bit later. So let us now invite the second resource person, Ms. Paula Di Perna. So Paula Di Perna is a pioneer in the development of carbon markets, a widely published author, and also a strategic global environmental policy advisor. She serves currently as special advisor to the CDP. And I think, yeah, you can also read it here. So I don't need to read all those things again. But definitely, Paula is one of the most experienced person in this issue. And now especially I see at least two important roles that we from Indonesia can learn also from your experience. Paula, the first one, of course, all your experience during the CCX, your time with CCX, but also what happened now with all this Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Market. So Paula, I know that you don't have a presentation, or do you want to do any presentation at this stage? Sorry, you are still muted. Sorry, Paula.
Sorry, everybody, that happens all the time, right? No, I do have some
I know.
slides, and I think Christina is going to put them up.
Sure. Okay.
Yes,
And
Nina.
also I want to, while that's happening, thank ICDX and thank you, Ms. Kiki, and of course, Alice and the other speakers. So just to echo a bit what Alice just said, I mean, and I've been to Indonesia, it's a fantastic country. And what I'm going to talk about is how we build a vanguard. And Indonesia can be the vanguard. And without a vanguard, we'll never solve this problem. And not only do we have the problem of reaching, not exhausting the carbon budget within the next decade, we've also lost at least 15 years of knowledge about carbon markets. These markets have been around a long time. They have already been working quite well. And we may, linking up is absolutely essential, but we could do it at a transactional basis as well. It doesn't have to necessarily be very, very complicated. We're already trading commodities across borders: rice, corn, soybean, oil. The plumbing is there. And what's really needed is to get started. So what I'm going to share with you a little bit is the experience of the Chicago Climate Exchange, which was the first real cap and trade in the world at a certain level. We were a network of early adopters, and we need to have a network of early adopters now. And that's, I think, a role Indonesia can really play. We also had a global participation. We were trading internationally. We linked up the EU ETS with our system in about 20 seconds. And so what we really need are a couple of major demonstrations, not only by governments, but by transaction and traders. So I'll just go to the next slide, and I'll just talk you through what we did at CCX. Critical, this word voluntary is kind of confusing. Voluntary, in my sense, in this world today means, outside of the compliance markets, but ultimately voluntary markets and some form of compliance caps must be linked. Otherwise, there won't be an ultimate reduction. Our system was, at the time we did CCX, we launched it in 2003, there really were no compliance markets outside of Europe. There was the EU ETS just beginning in its pilot phase. No compliance caps or any requirements in the United States. But we created a club of doers. And it was a voluntary but legally binding cap and trade system. The companies that volunteered into the system signed a legally binding civil contract. What did they contract to do? To make an inventory of their scope 1 and scope 2, all their North America operations, and reduce on a schedule that you see in front of you over first 4 years and then 4 more years when they signed up for the second phase. We set the targets as a consensus process. The target was tough, but doable. It was not a walk, not business as usual, but something that everybody agreed they could try. And recall, at that time, there were no inventories. There was nothing like the amount of knowledge that we have now. Christina, next slide, please. Okay, so we covered 6 gases. We're always talking about CO2, and as the chairman of ICDX said, CO2 is certainly the obvious one, and of course for sequestration, forests and peat, such as in Indonesia, capture CO2 mostly. However, methane is a very big deal, and there's opportunities to capture that. In Indonesia, fugitive emissions, people have been talking about capturing methane for years. There's no cap on that. That's something that really needs to happen. But then these other little gases, they're not so little. They offer opportunities. SF6, for example, is an insulator used to transmit power. If you reduce that, you get much more efficiency in your power transmission. And that could also be a kind of carbon credit. But so we're the only system that managed to cap all 6 gases. And we traded a carbon financial instrument, which was the equivalent of 1 ton of CO2e. Next slide, Christina. We tried to get everybody in. We had direct emitters, indirect emitters, cities. We had liquidity providers, traders, and offset providers. These were people who developed projects that were verified. When we had a doubt about the science, we just gave it a haircut, which is what they say in trading. We just made a very conservative estimate of the reductions achieved. And I think, again, back to integrity, there's an awful lot of discussion about it, but you can never have a perfect system. And when in doubt, you just make a conservative estimate and get going. There's no reason to really fixate over 1,000 tons or 1,500 tons. Those are de minimis numbers. Go ahead, please. We had tons of companies involved, the largest companies in the world: Cargill, Abbott, DuPont, Ford, Honeywell. These are companies that stepped up to volunteer when they did not have to. And become part of the world's first cap and trade system. They all have tremendous or had tremendous experience, which again, many of them never traded carbon before. They learned how to do it. And we have to recapture all of that momentum. The companies are all setting net zero targets. Many of them are also already using an internal carbon price, which CDP tracks. There's really no mystery. What's really missing is, 1, get started, and 2, a high degree of coherence. Perfection we'll never get to, but coherence is what we need. Next slide, Christina. We were huge relative to the compliance markets at the time. These little bars represent the baselines of each nation in the European emissions, the compliance market at the time. And as you can see, the CCX baseline, which is over to the left of my screen, was the highest of all. We had more emissions capped at that time in the United States than any other country in the world. And it's ironic that we have no cap in the United States today. But at that time, through this voluntary but legally binding system, which we thought of, we were a for-profit. Our business model was that if we, and the traders on the webinar will understand this, the commodities traders in particular, because carbon is a commodity, really, at the end of the day. Our model was, if we get all these people trading on our platform, when there is a mandatory market, mandatory rules, they will trade with us. We wanted to be a platform and an exchange that facilitated the government's policy. And the same can happen in Indonesia. A group of credible trading exchanges can very much facilitate the achievement of the NDC. Next slide, please. But just a quick review. Obviously, Alice talked about removals versus offsets. This is, again, a very big vocabulary debate, but the point is that a reduction or removal actually stops an emission and an offset balances out. You need both. You can't have one without the other, and only offsets won't work. You need a cap and you need a compliance structure, but it can be flexible, it can be variable. What's really critical is not so much linking the regulations, but linking the baselines. We never talk about tons. The atmosphere does not care how or even why we are making reductions, just that we do it, and it's by ton. Just the way if you want to lose a little weight, you go on the scale and you reduce by kilo. Your body doesn't care how you reduce, you just take the kilos off or put them on, depending on what you want to do. Next slide, please. We had a futures exchange. We were trading carbon at $13 a ton on the futures exchange way back in 2008. Some of the offsets today, as Alice said, are trading at $5. That's just really not a good price and won't make any change. So, the caps are very critical to driving higher prices, and demand side high prices would be very important for Indonesia, because you would be selling a lot of offset credits into those markets, and you would like to have the best price you can. A higher price doesn't come from inflation. A higher price comes from the caps and the ratcheting down of the supply of permissions to emit, if you want to call it that. But as I said, we already we're getting $13 a ton in 2008. EU ETS today is about $100 a ton. And that's the, anything below $40 or $50 a ton, as we've known, will not really stimulate a mitigation action. So we're looking for things that create a tighter cap and can create a more stringent demand for offset projects, so the offset price will go up. In terms of how people make money, it has nothing to do with what the carbon price actually is. People make money in these exchanges by transactions and volume. And so again, the commodities exchange model exists and we can just follow it. I don't think it's really necessary to create an entirely new set of plumbing. And, yes, there is some relationship to securities regulation, but we have to be careful not to create yet another kind of regulation. And also, securities are volatile. We see that today. You don't want to build that kind of volatility or excessive speculation and market timing, let's say, into a carbon market. That would not be good. Next slide, please. Important is that we were a precursor to a global system. Again, we were affiliated, we created the European Climate Exchange, which was is and still is the largest futures exchange in the EU ETX. We had joint ventures under exploration in Canada with the Montreal Commodities Exchange, also in Australia. We established the first of China's carbon pilots, the Tianjin Climate Exchange, with PetroChina, at that time the largest company in the world, nominally, with their division, China National Petroleum Corporation. That was in 2008. We were asked by the UK government, Tony Blair's government at the time, could we connect CCX, a little tiny voluntary, sort of big startup, with the existing EU ETS? One of our companies said yes. Baxter, they retired some allowances in the EU ETS, transferred them to their CCX account, and traded them in the United States. They took a loss on the price, but it was to demonstrate that the two systems could be linked. One was a voluntary market and one voluntary but legally binding. The other was an internationally regulated market. The transaction took about 20 seconds. That again was in 2008. Consider now the amazing amount of linkage that already exists among trading desks. So you could do these transactions, instantaneously. The key is the quality of the offset, the quality of the cap. And we had members worldwide. We had the city of Melbourne and all kinds of companies worldwide who joined us. Now, to the question of why, which is the next slide, why did any company want to do any of this voluntarily at the time? And why would any company now want to step up before required to do it? First of all, the inventory that you need to do in order to understand your carbon footprint is a blueprint for action. It's an operational plan. It's an X-ray on your operations. You can identify immediately your hidden risks and your hidden opportunities by doing the necessary work to prepare for carbon trading. Companies expected regulation. They were trying to hedge their regulatory risk, so they wanted to practice. They knew that commodities trading would have a role, and they wanted to learn by doing to understand what is a carbon unit, what is a carbon instrument. There was no understanding of it then, and we've lost a lot of understanding. We have to rebuild that understanding immediately. The companies also wanted to contribute to eventual national policy objectives. At that time, we were still in the aura of the Kyoto Protocol, and people expected an international regime, which we didn't get until 2015. And even Paris is not an international regime. It's a collection of national objectives. So, companies wanted to prepare for this. They're all expecting some form of international regulation. And so it was a first mover advantage. Consumers then, as now, even more now, are trying to buy products that they think are carbon neutral or are at least somehow offset or don't contribute to the problem. I think we can't go too far with that. At some point, we do have to stop consuming things, but for the moment, the consumer definitely wants to try to buy products that are more carbon sensitive. And that was true then. And companies wanted to say that their product line was also very much aware of climate change challenges. And ultimately, finally, the companies wanted to join to be leaders and to be seen to be in the vanguard. And that's what we need today. There's plenty of room in the vanguard. It's always lonely up there, but it's the most exciting place to be. I think I may have one more slide. This is just a repeat of the opening in Tianjin. They shot a big cannon full of gold confetti. That's how excited everybody was at that time. Next slide, please. We got a lot of press. I should talk about the founder, Dr. Richard Sandor, well-known economist, father of financial futures. This whole CCX thing was his brainchild. And I think he's in touch also with Mr. Carney. And we've done a briefing with Richard for the Integrity Council. He's a walking encyclopedia of commodities trading knowledge, very well known in Asia, and a very good friend of mine. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I will leave it there and I look forward to questions. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you, Paula. Very interesting. And also, I think one point that I got from your presentation earlier is that this carbon unit is basically being treated as commodity, right, in the international platform?
Well, that was definitely the thrust. It's certainly the way it's viewed in in the EU ETS, and it has very similar characteristics to the commodities we already know, and we're already trading them. There's no headache about trading commodities across borders, and if we follow that system, we'll get further ahead, I think.
Okay, thank you so much, and I'm sure that there are also some questions for you in the Q&A box. So feel free if you want to respond to that. Also, Alice earlier, if you want to respond to that directly in writing, but we can also bring them in the discussion a bit later. So now I would like to invite Pak Lemon Rutten to share also his view. As we all know, Pak Lemon is the Sorry, I think I muted myself somehow. So please, Pak Lemon, you can share. Yeah, of course, this is the CV of Pak Lemon, but I think Pak Lemon, you have time now to share your views and also maybe point that you want to bring in relation with all this voluntary carbon market and especially the place for doing the trading. And the issues in Indonesia as well. So please, Pak Lemon, you have the time.
Okay, thank you, Koki. And there is my presentation already. Okay, I want to very briefly discuss maybe somewhat embarrassing issue, the embarrassment of riches. Indonesia has an enormous opportunity in the voluntary carbon marketplace. But there is a big risk that this opportunity will be lost because of considerable confusion here in Indonesia about the difference between the voluntary market and the compliance market. And what I really want to do in these next few minutes is to try to clarify that the voluntary market is not a threat to the compliance market, as many people in the Indonesian government seem to believe, but that rather the compliance market can allow Indonesia to better achieve its NDCs and in the progress also create considerable extra value to the, well, not just the Indonesian economy, but also the Indonesian population. So overview of what I will be discussing. Next slide, please. A few words about what it is. Then I'll talk about, is there already a voluntary market in Indonesia? How does it relate to NDCs? And then why should the government not block the voluntary market? The cost of blocking it and the benefits of promoting it. And then how can we move this forward? Next slide. So what is it? Well, it's different group of people who really want to come together to jointly achieve climate goals. You've got companies that are active in this market, often for egoistical reasons, to improve their branding, to avoid problems in the future with accessing physical markets and financial markets. You've got individuals who want to offset their carbon footprints. And all these people want to buy carbon offsets. And on the other side, you've got a lot of investors, potentially trillions of dollars of money available to invest in generating the carbon benefits that these companies and individuals would then be willing to buy. So this is a market of willing buyers, willing sellers. Okay, no one is forced. Next slide. And this market is already relevant for Indonesia. First, Indonesia has a massive competitive advantage. Together with Brazil, those two countries, Brazil and Indonesia together, have more than half of the global offset capability. So if you really want to achieve the 2050 net zero goals, you can't do without Indonesia. And Indonesia can produce carbon benefits at a cost lower than virtually anyone else in the world. So there's a huge natural advantage, and Indonesia would be crazy not to exploit that natural advantage. Second, country image is very important, and the voluntary market will help a lot in giving a brand value to Indonesian carbon. On the voluntary market, carbon credits trade at widely different prices. And a big component of that price is really feeling, it's brands. And if you can attach a good brand, you know, Indonesian carbon is premium carbon. That's actually good for the whole country. And it is really the voluntary market that will build that brand. Third, millennials. The Indonesian population is dominated by millennials and Generation Z. And just like in other parts of the world, these millennials, Generation Z, worry about climate change. And there is already a movement there. And we have to mobilize these people to play their role. Then competitiveness. Indonesia there seem to be policymakers who believe you can stick your head in the sand and just ignore this global climate movement. And that's not going to happen. Already, Indonesian companies have been told by their value chain partners that they risk losing their position as suppliers if they don't develop net zero plans. There is something called Scope 3, which is the carbon emissions from your suppliers, and more Western countries, but also companies from other parts of the world, are becoming accountable for this Scope 3. So they are accountable for the carbon emitted by their suppliers. And if their suppliers don't have a plan, those suppliers will lose their position in the markets, in that value chain. There is a Standard Chartered report that says that Indonesia risks to lose $26 billion a year if Indonesian companies don't become active. And then finance. Already both equity and bond finance are much more expensive if you don't have a proper climate plan. That's a reality, and it's a reality now. It's not becoming a reality towards the end of this decade. So you can't stick your head in the sand, you have to get moving now. Then there's the issue of future proofing. There is an enormous scope for innovation in this sector. And that innovation typically comes from the private sector. And if you allow the voluntary market to develop, you will create many use cases, many new technologies that you can then roll out also for compliance schemes. So in a way, the voluntary market will be the development lab for the rest of the sector. And then brand value. There are clearly Indonesian companies that already have said they want to go for a triple bottom line. People, profit, planet. Okay, and there will be more and more of those companies. So this market is relevant today for Indonesia. We can't wait for 2026 before the government starts rolling out its compliance program. Sorry to be harsh, sound harsh, I'm Dutch. I've been here already 5 years, but I will remain a little bit blunt in these things. Next slide, please. Now, why is there this issue here in Indonesia? It's really because the relationship between the voluntary market and the compliance market is not well understood. Now, again, most buyers on the voluntary markets are there because they want to be there. No one is forcing them. They're not buying carbon credits to hand over to their governments. They're buying it to meet their corporate objectives. In other words, there is absolutely no issue with leaving the benefits of, let's say, an offset project in terms of reducing carbon emissions. That can still count in Indonesia, because if, let's say, Microsoft or Shell buys those carbon credits, they don't want to move those benefits from Indonesia to whatever, Holland or the UK. They're not interested in that. Okay, they're not buying because they're forced to buy. They buy because they want to buy. Now, okay, in the NDC, of course, there is a commitment of Indonesia to reduce its carbon emissions. In order to implement that commitment, part of it will be that the equivalent of pollution quota will be given to separate industries. Okay, fine. And in the Paris agreements, you can then make that tradable under either bilateral agreements or through a multilateral platform, which, in my opinion, yeah, we would all wish for it, but it's quite unlikely. So the most likely bilateral agreements, like we've already seen between Switzerland and a couple of other countries. So yes, it's possible to transfer, but this is under government-to-government agreements. Without a government agreement, if, let's say, Shell buys carbon credits in Indonesia, the reduction in carbon emissions that results in Indonesia stays in Indonesia. The companies can't decide, let's just move this to another country. That's not how it works. So please, if there are government officials here, understand that. No carbon benefits, no carbon mitigation can be moved from Indonesia to any other country without there being a bilateral government-to-government agreement signed by Indonesia. And then Indonesia will have to specify exactly under what conditions you can transfer carbon emissions, and then exactly what can be transferred. Now, and this is not just in the Paris Agreement. The presidential decree that was mentioned says the same thing. You can only move carbon credits out of Indonesia with the permission of the Indonesian government. So there's really no risk for the compliance regime. Okay, you can have a voluntary market. That doesn't mean that somehow Western countries are cheaply getting Indonesia to do their job. Okay, not without the government's permission. And the government would only give permission if there is a win-win scenario there. Next slide. So the confusion is really in this Paris Agreement that allows the private sector to contribute by doing work in one country and transferring it. However, this is only possible under explicit government-to-government agreements. Okay, so don't be afraid, please, of this voluntary market. Next slide. Now, the costs of blocking the voluntary market are considerable because, as I said, this is already an issue now. You can't really force companies to wait for years before the compliance regime is in place. European Union has already announced carbon border adjustment measures. I already mentioned Indonesia's annual exports are under threat if Indonesian providers are unable to have net zero plans. High costs are already an issue. And Boston Consulting Group survey shows that there is already more and more, the majority of Indonesian consumers already want to make their consumption greener. These things are happening now. There is a real impact on Indonesian governments if the development of the voluntary markets is blocked. Okay, so we have to get out of this current situation. Next one. On the other hand, if you allow the voluntary markets to come in, the benefits are multiple. Partnerships with some of the technically most advanced companies in the world. There will be a transfer of technology that's possible. Awareness raising, because all these millennials can be parts of the solution. Speed to markets. The voluntary market is ready to roll out now. Investments are available now. Projects can start tomorrow. Okay, there's no reason to wait. Ownership. I mean, people can actually become themselves investors in offset projects. There will be much more of a shared ownership of this fighting the climate crisis. I already mentioned innovation, local communities. The offset projects here in Indonesia, many of them are in the parts of the country where people are poor and have less opportunities than in the big cities. Now, if you really want to stop or at least slow down the migration from these areas into the big cities, you have to create development opportunities there. And that's what offset projects do. Okay, offset projects really are good for local communities. And they will also then bring in local authorities, which is another development priority. And then an important one, flexibility. Right now, there are not that many internationally accepted standards. And I've been active in this for a long, long time. And many of these standards date from my early years, from the 1990s. And that means that in practice, a lot of these international standards are expensive. They don't really use modern technology like drones or satellite imaging, artificial intelligence. And there is a large scope for developing new standards. And in fact, many of the buyers on the voluntary markets want to have their own standards. So there's a great opportunity here for Indonesia as potentially a major supplier to the world market to develop their own standards, just like China has done. And in those standards, you can use new technologies, and that will make it in turn possible to do more small-scale projects. You don't. Why does a project need to be 100,000 hectares? Well, one reason is the very high fixed cost of existing verification mechanisms. Indonesia can innovate, and that would be in the voluntary market that these things are done. And then finally, co-benefits. We talk here about carbon credits, but in reality, the price that is paid for a carbon credit has a big component that is not the carbon. It is the other benefits that the project brings. Will the project protect orangutans? Will it support biodiversity? Will it help women? Is it for cooperatives? Those are called co-benefits. The government will not be able to extract those co-benefit values. Okay, so if you don't allow the voluntary markets to properly trade these mechanisms and to get a proper price for co-benefits, Indonesia will lose a massive part of the true value of these offset projects. Okay, next one. So in conclusion, while sorting out the admittedly very complex details of a compliance regime, well, okay, fine, do that. But allow the voluntary markets to get moving. It will help you. The voluntary market will deliver benefits that count towards the government goals without costing the government any money. It will generate innovations that can later be adopted also in the compliance sectors. It will build a brand, Indonesia. And this market already exists. We've seen transactions happening in Singapore between Indonesian buyers and Indonesian sellers, simply because Indonesia doesn't allow that to happen in Indonesia. What sense does it make to send Indonesian buyers and sellers to Singapore? Okay, so there are already willing buyers and sellers. Allow this to happen. And why not? So my final slide, we've been ready. Next one, please. We've been ready. We have the infrastructure. We have a depository. We have a marketplace. We have a clearing system. So there's really no cost for the government. It's plug and play. Interfaces are ready. The only thing that's missing is this understanding of the government between the relationship between the voluntary markets and the compliance markets. And I hope that I've convinced everyone on this call that it's really necessary to overcome that bottleneck. There is no problem with the voluntary market. It will help NDCs and basically, yeah, let these markets go here in Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Palamon, on your sharing your views also. And I think this is a very issue that that you mentioned earlier. This is the issue that most of I think the carbon projects, how do you call it, owner at the moment are facing. So let's see how this can be solved. And I'm sure that at the end, even though we are talking about voluntary and obligatory, if I can say, under the Article 6, then we need to make sure, and as you already mentioned also, in fact, at the end, the one that can decide whether any unit can be used by other parties is the government. So I hope that this will, the message will also get to the government and can be considered also for the next session. So yeah, we have, I think we are quite good in time. We still have like 25 minutes, 20 minutes maybe for our discussion. I know that there are so many questions on the Q&A box, and I'm sure that unfortunately we won't be able to address all of them, but I think I have at least here 2 questions that can be addressed, I hope, to all of the our resource person. This is about the transferring credit. So the question is basically we will have this transferring credits between different markets. Yeah, and this is also has been carried out as already mentioned earlier by Paula. Are these credit limited to a certain sector or project types only, or how this kind of units will be traded or has been traded earlier? Maybe Paula, if you can share this with us. Thank you.
Well, there are all kinds of project types. And as Lamon just said, there's tremendous technology now to verify what the project is actually accomplishing. You know, people speak mostly about forestation, reforestation. I noticed that, excuse me, there were some questions in the Q&A from farmers. You know, I don't know about the soil content in Indonesia, but certainly in many places, the soil captures carbon and farmers can adopt practices that release less carbon. You know, I mentioned methane capture. There are all kinds of, you know, people talk about, you know, dairy farms being so terrible and livestock being so terrible, but you can capture the methane and you can turn that into a credit. So there's a tremendous amount of project type, but at the end of the day, it's one measurement, a ton of CO2e, which is reduced or offset regardless of the project type. And it's very important what Lemon said about satellite monitoring, because, for example, standing forests, Indonesia, you can kind of estimate the amount that Indonesia could sell into a market. But if there are severe typhoons and severe disruption, that CO2 potential is completely changed. So there has to be an ongoing kind of monitoring, which can be expensive. And this makes a drag on the market, because then, you know, you're paying so much to verify that you're not earning in the market. So this is where it becomes important to have models that estimate credibly, so that the project developer is not bearing all the costs of verification to the point that there's no profit.
Thank you. Thanks, Paula, for that. If anyone else want to add also on that, maybe. All right. So
I mean, I just want to also, Alice asked me and other people did, what happened to CCX? And, it's like my child, it graduated. But again, this was such an example of the importance of regulatory certainty and regulatory structure, because when the United States did not, there was a lot of momentum to pass a national cap and trade, which that US House of Representatives did, but then it didn't get to the Senate. That's a whole complicated political story. But the fact is that we did not adopt a national guidance, and therefore the companies no longer needed to practice. They had learned what they had to learn, and they said, fine, we'll just go our own way. So our business model, we retired CCX, not before we sold the business to ICE, which remains very involved in environmental markets. So, it served its purpose as a pilot. And what I keep saying is that there's room for another similar pilot. I mean, countries should just get together and do a pilot of international demonstration trades. Willing participants could step up and try it. You never know until you try.
great.
Just to test the system, whereas really in the real world, because so much of what is discussed today is in theory.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Paula. That's very important to be noted. Alice, I saw that your hand has been raised. Please.
I was going to say, I mean, for me, I come from a public policy background, so I tend to have faith in public policy makers ultimately to provide supporting infrastructure or enabling infrastructure, etc. I think what I'm taking from this conversation is sort of kind of care needed, in the sense that, as very well described by both of the other panelists, having the private sector crack on with local markets and linked markets and so on, micro markets, is incredibly important. And I know from my experience in Indonesia that you have enormous potential to come up with innovative solutions and tech solutions and so on, as described for monitoring projects and so on and so forth. But so allowing that stuff to flourish, and test what works, doesn't work, build expertise in companies, build expertise amongst citizens, is really important. But it seems also like there's an important role and a motivating and an incentive that at some point either you're going to be required to do this, or it's going to cost you a lot if you don't do it, if I could put it that way. And so it seems like past experiences have, if the US government had been able to bring in the necessary policy, your nascent market, no doubt would have continued to grow and build, and we'd be in a much better place than we are. So I think the art to this is going to be making sure that infrastructure that government can provide comes, but without it squashing the private sector efforts in the meantime. So I guess that's the sort of main thing I've taken from this discussion so far.
Thank you so much, Alice. And I think we don't have much time, but let me send these questions to all of you. I think it's quite interesting. What are the future of organized voluntary carbon marketplace from your perspectives? I would put the first one. And is it something that we have to preserve and adopt as long-term global environment management plan? Or is it something that will meet to an end in some period of time in the future? And do you think that carbon market or trade is the most effective way to make our world a better and a greener place? So I think I will start with Pak Lemon, and then Paula, and then Alice then. So please, Pak Lemon first.
I actually think education is the best way to make the world a better place, and then everything else will fall in place. People, well-educated people, understand that they have to deal with climate change. it addresses the root of the problem. I must confess, I was actually thinking about some of the other questions that I read in the Q&A lists. And there's one that I would like to, well, there are two that I would like to address. One, how do you mainstream these markets? I think what is happening, what will be happening there is simply transparency. Companies will start writing about what they do. They will either include chapters in their annual reports, or they will put parts on their website where they describe what they do. And that will automatically become more and more in-depth and more, if you want, real. If you start, I mean, ICDX is developing a carbon footprint in Bahasa Indonesia. And there are carbon footprints in English available on the internet. And that's a good starting point. It starts you understand, to make you understand as a company the relationship between what you do and the carbon emissions that you're responsible for. But as you are doing that, you're learning. So I think that is how it will come. Companies will simply start because either even many of the staff will ask for it. So there will be pressure both inside and outside the company just to get started. And then I think people like us have to give them the tools. We have to give them the footprint generators. We have to give them the reports. We have to give them examples. And it will automatically then, if you want, mainstream. And I really think that this will be mainstream by the end of this decade, without any government pressure even. It will be the pressure from bottom up. A second point, will these markets become global? Well, greenhouse gases mix in the outer atmosphere. So it's one and the same problem globally. Unfortunately, there won't be a global market. There are too many differences in government policies. So you will have regional markets, and even if you national markets, regional and national. Even if you have international trade, that trade will be seriously restricted. For example, a company will be only allowed to buy 10%, 20% of its offsets in another country. So there will be serious differences in rules, and therefore also there will be very serious differences in prices. Here in Indonesia, the government wants to start with the price of 20 cents per ton. The international market price is no less than $5. Okay, so to the extent that Indonesia will allow Indonesian companies to sell outside of Indonesia, they will be able to achieve a much better price, definitely. But there will always be quota, it will always be regulated. It will not be automatically become one global market.
All right, thank you, Pak Lamon. So may I now invite Paula to share your views on this, Paula?
So, thank you. As to the world being a better place, I think, do unto others as you would like others to do unto you. I think that's the number one way we should all behave, and the world will become better. As to the carbon market being the answer, I mean, carbon market, everybody wants it to accomplish something different. If you are trying to prioritize the benefits, say, to the farmers and the project developers, precisely you want a price that will make it possible for them to implement the project. If you're trying to reduce carbon emissions, you want the least transaction cost possible. If you're trying to create an international structure, you want as much international agreement as possible. And on and on. There are all kinds of wishes for the purpose of the carbon market, but it has only one purpose, which is to reduce global carbon burden. And, if you try to think about how currency is traded, that's another kind of parallel. That somehow everybody has their own money, but we managed to make it work. We managed to understand that this many dollars is this many euros, is this many rand, is this many yuan. We make it work, and we can make carbon work. I think it's a very, very critical tool because there's some benefit in it for everybody. And carbon emissions are not a pollutant in the strict sense. They are a byproduct of industry and of economic growth. So at some point, not only should there be a benefit for everyone, but everyone needs to share in solving the problem. And the carbon market enables the quote burden of addressing the problem to be shared fairly.
Thank you, Paula. Alice, please.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up a couple of points that others have mentioned. So on the point about transparency, all of the financial institutions in GFANs, the 450 and growing, have committed to net zero and to reporting their annual progress. And so they haven't all started doing that yet because they agreed to it within this year. But we are putting out a transition planning framework that we expect them to use, which says, you know, how are they going to transition to net zero? But it also covers off how are they going to engage with the corporate that they finance. So this should increase information, it should increase engagement with corporates. And as mentioned, you know, it'd be great if Indonesian companies were not negatively impacted by the efforts of the West to transition, because, you know, they're not able to show that they themselves are involved in carbon offsets, carbon removals, etc. So I think it's good that global firms are thinking about this, because if they don't, we're not going to make it. But at the same time, if we don't put in the kind of infrastructure we're talking about here, then, you know, we can have unintended consequences. And I do think there's a risk that the way we are pursuing net zero transition in advanced economies is a bit self-focused at times, and can have these consequences. So you know, in some ways, I think it's important that a country like Indonesia, as mentioned, has huge potential. So if we can make a voluntary market work there, you know, it could be really powerful for Indonesia, but also for other countries in a similar position. Thanks.
Thank you, Alice, for that. And I think we are almost come to the end of our session today. As I said, it's always like, you know, this kind of conversation, then time just flies. But before we close the session, I would like to ask all the resource person to have like maximum 1 minute closing statement from your side. So I will start with Alice, Paula, and then Pa Lamon before I offer later to Pa Megan to do the closing remarks. So Alice, please.
Thanks very much. I haven't prepared. I mean, what I would like to say is just that I found this discussion very helpful. And I think, just as mentioned, the work we're doing in GFANs to try and get the global financial system to transition is incredibly important, because it puts pressure on real economy companies. It also puts pressure on government to deliver policy and so on and so forth. But the one thing I'm going to take away from this discussion is to go back and look at how we, in our work, treat voluntary carbon markets, think about voluntary carbon markets, and just check that, you know, concerns that do exist about their integrity, sometimes about the quality, etc., are not leading us to be so cautious in the way we interact with them that we're actually part of the problem rather than the solution. Because I know in our focus to try and get global financial institutions to transition, sometimes we might say, well, don't rely too much on kind of offsets if they can't, if you should be reducing your emissions, and don't, and standards aren't high enough, so etc. So I think the thing I would take away is that I'd like to think a bit harder about how we interact with the efforts that you're trying to foster. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alice. Paula, please.
Yes, thank you again very much for having this very comprehensive view of things. I think my summation really is that Indonesia can be a world leader in setting up doable rules, and some of the things that Lamon mentioned, where you can have a guarantee that the benefits of the reductions remain in the account of Indonesia, even though it's a global system. Any obstacle to setting up a viable voluntary carbon market system that has bearing on a compliance market and ties into the NDC, any obstacle is surmountable. There is no obstacle that should prevent us. And my experience is that we just need to try a few things and do some demos and really accelerate the demonstration. And that's the best way to learn, I think. And thanks again.
Thank you so much, Paula. And last but not least, definitely, Pak Lamon, your closing statement.
Okay, just 2 points. A couple of the questions that we got are from small companies that want to be part of this climate change process. Fantastic. And frankly, that's what the voluntary market is for, to bring you together with people that you can partner with in different ways, as a supply chain, basically as a preferred buyer, or as a project financier, or in any other way. And those things can only happen in a voluntary market, because you can't put that into the strict schemes of Verra's, the expensive big international certifications. Okay, the voluntary market is a place where people will experiment. Okay. Second point, according to the international estimates, the voluntary market will grow 50 to 100-fold in the next years. Okay, 50 to 100-fold. Question to anyone in this forum: do you want Indonesia to be part of that? If so, yeah, just do it. Get ready. Thanks.
Thank you, Pak Lamon. So we already heard from all our resource person, and also earlier the opening remarks. Now, as we only have like 3 minutes away from ending of our session, then I would like to invite Pak Megan Wijaya from the Standing Committee of Trade, Indonesian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, to deliver the closing remarks. So please, Pak Megan.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Greetings to our honorable and distinguished speakers today. Arif Rahmat, the chair of B20 Trade and Investment Task Force. Alice Carr, the executive director, public policy, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Paula De Perna, special advisor of CDP, member, distinguished advisory board, Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. Maman Rutan, CEO of ICDX. Kuki Sujamon, the co-founder and executive director of IRIT. On behalf of Indonesia's Chamber of Commerce and Industry, we would like to thank the organizers and speakers for this wonderful event. Throughout the presentations from different speakers today, we could draw a conclusion that the formation of a carbon market as a market-based instrument to help address climate change crisis is essential. The formation of the carbon market needs to be transparent, inclusive, and operated in the highest integrity that adheres to global best practices. Not only that, in developing this market, a collaborative and concerted effort needs to be emphasized in order to serve multi-stakeholders' interests and aligning the vision. Additionally, the framework for the cross-border carbon market needs to be planned and anticipated early on, so that the scalability of the market can reach its full potential. We all agree here that a fully functional carbon market will definitely help a country like Indonesia to help achieve its NDC, and we're very hopeful to see on how the carbon market implementation could be expedited. We also had the opportunity to learn from Chicago Climate Exchange, the world's first carbon market, and how it gives birth to all the forms of carbon market globally, and how we could continue the legacy and build a global carbon market hub for humanity. Furthermore, the right regulatory framework to foster the carbon market is crucial, and based on global best practices, it is mostly regulated as commodity, as it exhibits more commodity traits compared to securities. In conclusion, all three speakers further agree that the carbon market is one of the best market-based instruments to move the world in unison to help achieve carbon neutrality in the future, create global visibility for conservation projects, creating larger awareness of the impact of climate change and how individuals and companies could be the leader or vanguard in saving the earth. To add on and give more context, based on our data, Indonesia's tropical rainforests are the third largest rainforest in the world with 125.9 million hectares. That translates to a potential carbon sequestration of 25 billion tons. Indonesia's peatlands are largest in the world with 7.5 million hectares and the potential carbon sequestration of 55 billion tons. And mangrove, or people call it the blue carbon, has a potential of 3.31 million hectares with around 33 billion tons of carbon sequestration from the atmosphere. So altogether, Indonesia could be the world's biggest natural climate solution with the potential of carbon sequestration up to 113 gigaton from the atmosphere. So if it's managed properly, it could be the next significant driver for Indonesia's green-based economy, equating it to a potential up to $500 billion at the average price of $5 per metric ton. We also believe that the Indonesia's natural resources could also become the country's competitiveness to exert influence in global efforts to tackle the climate change crisis. Indonesia could definitely take advantage of its natural wealth to become the axis of climate change policies, one of which is through an organized carbon market. And we believe that the Indonesia has already issued a presidential regulations number 98 of 2021 regarding the implementation of carbon economic values. We believe that the existence of the presidential regulation has made Indonesia a global driving force in responding to market-based climate change at the global level toward a sustainable economic recovery. Lastly, I would like to thank all our distinguished speakers today for their excellent presentations. Kadin, or Indonesia's Chamber of Commerce and Industry, as the organizer of the B20 Forum, and also helping the success of the G20 Indonesia presidency, hope that this event could provide a new understanding for the public and support the government in taking policy directions in the climate and post-pandemic economic recovery agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pak Megan, for your, very, encouraging message as well. And I think this is the time for all of us, especially us in Indonesia, but definitely with a lot of support from Paula and Alice also in the future, because we need to move forward. We have to take this opportunity because I think the window of opportunity may not be that big. So let's see how we can move on this issue. And as already mentioned earlier, definitely we need to, how do you call it? We need to get all the potential benefit for Indonesia, especially with all these nature-based solutions, something that has been there, and now it's time to basically to make it happen for us. So again, I'm Kuki Suyahmun. And now I would like to thank everyone, definitely our resource person, as well as Pak Megan, and also Mbak Christina that already been here, preparing everything. And also to all the participants. And I just checked, I think we almost hit 400, I think more than 350 in one of the time. So it's very good. And I know there are quite a lot of information, and also maybe I know ICDX will have another session to explore further, because there are a lot of interest also in this issue. So again, thank you very much, everyone, and have a good afternoon and good day for you, Paula and Alice. Goodbye.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.